Some people judge a man by his clothes. Others judge by his wealth. But today, a lesson will be learned. True value isn't measured in money. The showroom was pristine, bathed in the warm glow of overhead lights that made the luxury cars appear almost surreal. The polished floors gleamed, reflecting the sleek curves of high-end sedans, sports cars, and grand touring vehicles, machines designed not just to drive, but to impress. The air carried the unmistakable scent of new leather and fresh paint, with a faint trace of expensive cologne lingering from the wealthy patrons who roamed the showroom. But amidst all the extravagance, a solitary figure walked through the glass doors, a man whose appearance starkly contrasted the opulence around him. Henry Carter, a retired schoolteacher in his late 60s, stood in the doorway, quietly taking in the showroom. His clothes were simple: dark slacks, a button-up shirt, and well-worn shoes. But there was a dignity in his posture, a calm that came from years of teaching and living a life of modest but meaningful purpose. He didn't belong here in the traditional sense. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have the fast car or the tailored suit, but he had something that the gleaming vehicles and polished surfaces didn't: experience. For Henry, the cars were a symbol of something greater, a lifetime of hard work, sacrifice, and dreams deferred. He had always admired the beauty of a luxury car, but it wasn't until his retirement that he had the time to indulge his curiosity. This showroom, this glimmering display of wealth and status, was where he'd always imagined walking through, even if he hadn't ever thought he'd actually find a way to belong. As Henry stood at the entrance, the automatic doors whooshed quietly behind him. The crowd was a mixture of well-dressed individuals, the affluent, the privileged. Some were clearly there to browse, others to make purchases. In their tailored suits and dresses, they moved with the kind of confidence only afforded to those with money to burn. Henry was used to this kind of treatment, the kind where people sized him up based on the surface. His clothes were neat but unremarkable, his demeanor humble, not arrogant. But in a space like this, appearances were everything, and his presence was an anomaly. The moment he stepped further into the showroom, the shift was palpable. The hum of conversation slowed, and some heads turned. Henry wasn't bothered by the stares. He had spent a lifetime learning that the world's judgment meant little, but the weight of it was undeniable. In this place, he didn't look like the kind of man who could afford to purchase a car of this magnitude. The low murmurs of curiosity filled the air, and Henry could feel the unspoken judgment hanging between the sleek cars and their would-be buyers. A salesman, sharply dressed in a suit that was too new, approached him with a smile. His eyes were polite, but carried an unmistakable curiosity. "Good afternoon, sir," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with the faintest trace of skepticism. "Can I help you with anything today?" Henry gave him a nod, his voice warm and steady. "I was just looking at the cars. Been dreaming about them for years." The salesman's smile tightened, and he glanced at the cars around them. "Of course, sir. These are some of the finest vehicles in the world," he said with practiced ease. "Perhaps you're looking for something specific? A sports car? A sedan?" Henry looked at the row of vehicles, his eyes gleaming with appreciation. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for yet. Just admiring the craftsmanship. It's beautiful. I've never had the chance to see these up close." The salesman nodded, clearly uncertain whether Henry was a serious customer. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know," he said, retreating to a group of well-dressed potential buyers nearby. Henry watched him go, his fingers lightly touching the curve of a high-performance sedan, his thoughts drifting to days long past. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He wasn't here for validation. He was here to simply appreciate something he had never had the privilege of owning. His retirement had come with a modest pension, and though he had made his life as fulfilling as possible, he never had the luxury of such luxuries as these. But Henry wasn't complaining. He had taught generations of students, shaping lives with the wisdom of years and the joy of learning. He had raised children, guided minds, and given his all to a world that seldom took notice of people like him. This showroom, and the cars in it, represented a dream he had never realized, but had always quietly carried in his heart. A dream that was, for a moment, about to be brought into focus, not by the sum of money he had accumulated, but by the dignity he had earned. The wealth around him, the cars, the attention, they meant little in comparison to the quiet knowledge that Henry was, in fact, richer than most. He had lived a life of purpose, of teaching and love, and nothing about that would ever change, no matter who walked past him in the showroom. As he turned to leave, one of the cars caught his eye again, gleaming with a luster that could only come from both money and passion. Henry stood by the Rolls-Royce, his hand lingering on the smooth surface, admiring the car as he always had. For him, this wasn't just a luxury item. It was the culmination of years of hard work, dedication, and dreams that could never be realized. But in this moment, surrounded by the gleaming machines of the wealthy, Henry allowed himself a brief moment of appreciation. The light bounced off the sleek finish of the car, making it look even more ethereal. He had always respected these cars, not out of jealousy, but because they represented the pinnacle of craftsmanship and design, things that Henry himself valued. Then, the harsh voice cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. Are you lost?" Henry turned slowly, his calm demeanor betraying none of the surprise or anger he might have been feeling. The woman who spoke was impeccably dressed, sharp and assertive, with an air of authority that came from managing a luxury showroom. Margaret Sterling, the showroom manager, stood with a slight sneer, scanning Henry from head to toe. Her eyes were sharp, almost accusing, as though she couldn't quite place why he was there, but already knew that he didn't belong. "We don't allow loitering here," Margaret continued, her voice dismissive. Henry's chest tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not loitering," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm here to look at the cars." Margaret's expression shifted. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze turning more judgmental. "If you're here to beg, do it somewhere else," she snapped, the words dripping with disdain. Henry stood motionless, the sting of her words cutting through the air like a blade. He had spent his entire life teaching, providing, helping others, never once thinking of himself as less than anyone else. But in this moment, Margaret's words struck a nerve. She had assumed something about him based on his appearance. She hadn't even asked. She had decided instantly that he didn't belong. Her laughter echoed through the showroom, loud and piercing. "These cars start at $500,000, she said, her voice laced with derision. "Do you even have that in your bank?" Her tone dripped with superiority. She didn't see Henry as a person. He was simply a problem to be dismissed, a nuisance that didn't fit the shiny, perfect world she was managing. Margaret's eyes darted around the showroom, noticing the curious stares from the other customers, some now looking away uncomfortably, others with a mix of pity and amusement. Henry could feel their gazes, some judgmental, others embarrassed for him. But what hurt most wasn't the onlookers, but the way Margaret saw him. She had dismissed him the moment she laid eyes on him, simply because he didn't belong in her carefully curated world. Before he could respond, Margaret snapped her fingers. "Security! Escort this man out," she ordered, her tone final. Henry stood tall. His hands clenched, but he made no move to resist. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He wasn't there to make a scene. All he wanted was to appreciate what was in front of him, but now his quiet dignity was being tested. The showroom was silent, the tension palpable, as the security guards who had been watching the exchange moved toward him. They weren't here to protect the customer, not today. They were here to remove the problem. Henry didn't speak. He simply stood there, unmoving, as the two guards approached, their faces blank, ready to do as they were told. His heart raced, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that in a place like this, his worth wasn't measured by who he was or what he had done, but by the clothes on his back and the color of his skin. But before the guards could touch him, a new voice rang out from across the showroom floor. It was calm, powerful, and it immediately commanded attention. "Wait!" Everyone turned. The voice belonged to a man, a well-dressed individual, clearly someone with authority. He wasn't a part of the regular crowd of shoppers. His presence was commanding, but his voice held no malice, only a quiet strength. "Let him be," the man continued, his eyes locking onto Margaret. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The guards hesitated, looking to Margaret for direction, but she didn't speak. Her surprise was written all over her face. Henry stood still, not sure who had spoken, but sensing that something important was unfolding. The man who had intervened took a few steps toward the scene, his gaze not on Henry, but on the showroom manager. He had lived a life of purpose, of teaching and love, and nothing about that would ever change, no matter who walked past him in the showroom. As he turned to leave, one of the cars caught his eye again, gleaming with a luster that could only come from both money and passion. Henry stood by the Rolls-Royce, his hand lingering on the smooth surface, admiring the car as he always had. For him, this wasn't just a luxury item. It was the culmination of years of hard work, dedication, and dreams that could never be realized. But in this moment, surrounded by the gleaming machines of the wealthy, Henry allowed himself a brief moment of appreciation. The light bounced off the sleek finish of the car, making it look even more ethereal. He had always respected these cars, not out of jealousy, but because they represented the pinnacle of craftsmanship and design, things that Henry himself valued. Then, the harsh voice cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. Are you lost?" Henry turned slowly, his calm demeanor betraying none of the surprise or anger he might have been feeling. The woman who spoke was impeccably dressed, sharp and assertive, with an air of authority that came from managing a luxury showroom. Margaret Sterling, the showroom manager, stood with a slight sneer, scanning Henry from head to toe. Her eyes were sharp, almost accusing, as though she couldn't quite place why he was there, but already knew that he didn't belong. "We don't allow loitering here," Margaret continued, her voice dismissive. Henry's chest tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not loitering," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm here to look at the cars." Margaret's expression shifted. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze turning more judgmental. "If you're here to beg, do it somewhere else," she snapped, the words dripping with disdain. Henry stood motionless, the sting of her words cutting through the air like a blade. He had spent his entire life teaching, providing, helping others, never once thinking of himself as less than anyone else. But in this moment, Margaret's words struck a nerve. She had assumed something about him based on his appearance. She hadn't even asked. She had decided instantly that he didn't belong. Her laughter echoed through the showroom, loud and piercing. "These cars start at $500,000, she said, her voice laced with derision. "Do you even have that in your bank?" Her tone dripped with superiority. She didn't see Henry as a person. He was simply a problem to be dismissed, a nuisance that didn't fit the shiny, perfect world she was managing. Margaret's eyes darted around the showroom, noticing the curious stares from the other customers, some now looking away uncomfortably, others with a mix of pity and amusement. Henry could feel their gazes, some judgmental, others embarrassed for him. But what hurt most wasn't the onlookers, but the way Margaret saw him. She had dismissed him the moment she laid eyes on him, simply because he didn't belong in her carefully curated world. Before he could respond, Margaret snapped her fingers. "Security! Escort this man out," she ordered, her tone final. Henry stood tall. His hands clenched, but he made no move to resist. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He wasn't there to make a scene. All he wanted was to appreciate what was in front of him, but now his quiet dignity was being tested. The showroom was silent, the tension palpable, as the security guards who had been watching the exchange moved toward him. They weren't here to protect the customer, not today. They were here to remove the problem. Henry didn't speak. He simply stood there, unmoving, as the two guards approached, their faces blank, ready to do as they were told. His heart raced, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that in a place like this, his worth wasn't measured by who he was or what he had done, but by the clothes on his back and the color of his skin. But before the guards could touch him, a new voice rang out from across the showroom floor. It was calm, powerful, and it immediately commanded attention. "Wait!" Everyone turned. The voice belonged to a man, a well-dressed individual, clearly someone with authority. He wasn't a part of the regular crowd of shoppers. His presence was commanding, but his voice held no malice, only a quiet strength. "Let him be," the man continued, his eyes locking onto Margaret. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The guards hesitated, looking to Margaret for direction, but she didn't speak. Her surprise was written all over her face. Henry stood still, not sure who had spoken, but sensing that something important was unfolding. The man who had intervened took a few steps toward the scene, his gaze not on Henry, but on the showroom manager. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, clearly assessing the situation with precision. "I think we need to reevaluate how we treat people in here," he said quietly, his voice still carrying authority, but devoid of anger. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to falter. The guards, once eager to follow her orders, now looked uncertain. The man smiled just a little, as though he'd seen all he needed to see. He turned to Henry. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softer now. Henry nodded. But before he could say anything, the man gave a slight wave to the security guards. "Let him go. He's here as a guest, just like everyone else." Margaret stood motionless, her face flush with embarrassment. Her pride had been struck down without a word from Henry. Margaret's eyes widened as David stepped forward. The room grew eerily quiet. The tension was thick, and the air seemed to hum with disbelief. Her smug expression faltered, the calm confidence that usually dominated her demeanor slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had assumed that she could control this situation, but the reality of what was unfolding was beyond her expectations. "David," she asked, her voice slightly shaking now, "what are you doing here?" David didn't even glance in her direction. His attention was fixed entirely on Henry, standing tall and unmoving, his dignity shining through. The shock on Margaret's face was palpable, but it wasn't nearly as stunning as the words that were about to leave David's mouth. David paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then, in a voice that held a quiet but powerful authority, he spoke the words that would change everything in the showroom. "That man is my father." For a split second, the entire room was still. The murmurs and whispers that had already started circulating among the patrons abruptly ceased. Everyone's attention shifted from Henry to David, and then back to Henry once again. The realization was slow to sink in, but when it did, it felt like the entire world had shifted beneath them. Margaret's face drained of color, the shock evident on her features. Her eyes flicked nervously between David and Henry, as if trying to piece together the sudden revelation that she was now faced with. David's eyes remained calm, steady, focused on Henry, and then he added with a sharp edge to his voice, "I didn't expect to find you here, but I should have known. This is exactly the kind of place you'd go, isn't it?" He paused, watching Margaret carefully. Not everyone gets to walk into a showroom like this, and certainly not everyone deserves it. But my father does. Henry stood silent, his hands resting calmly by his sides. For a brief moment, David's words filled the air, heavy with power and truth. Henry didn't flinch or say a word, letting his son's assertion stand on its own. The sheer weight of the truth hit Margaret in waves as her smugness began to unravel. The patrons in the showroom, who had been watching in awkward silence, now shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the man they had so casually judged, Henry, was not only respected, but was, in fact, a part of the very foundation they had all taken for granted. David, the heir apparent, wasn't simply a businessman. He was a son who was honoring his father. Margaret's composure completely evaporated as she tried to regain control of the situation. "David, she started, her voice weak and stammering. But she couldn't finish the sentence. David wasn't listening. He was focused on the man who had quietly earned his place in the world, despite the prejudice he had faced his entire life. David turned toward the crowd, his tone still commanding, but with a hint of something deeper, something akin to resolve. "Let's set the record straight here. My father has just as much right to be in this showroom as anyone else. This is not some playground for the rich and privileged to judge others. My father's earned his place in this world, just like anyone else, and I'll make sure that the way people are treated here reflects that from now on." He paused, glancing back at Margaret, whose face was flushed with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. "Margaret, you're fired. I'll make sure you understand the gravity of what you've done here today." There was a deep silence in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Margaret stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and regret, and yet there was no denying the shift that had just taken place. David turned back to Henry, offering a small, knowing smile. "Thank you, Father. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Henry simply nodded, his face unreadable. But his eyes, those eyes that had seen so much yet had always remained full of dignity, now held a quiet pride. As David gestured for Henry to follow him, the showroom staff began to stir. The patrons, still processing the shift in the dynamic, began to whisper amongst themselves. The air, once thick with judgment and prejudice, had cleared, replaced with an uncomfortable but undeniable sense of respect. David led his father to a table near the back of the showroom, away from the spotlight. For the first time in the showroom's history, the real value of a man wasn't measured by the price of a car or the wealth in his wallet. It was measured by his character and the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Margaret stood, her face still burning with shame, but it was clear that she had learned a lesson she would never forget. As David and Henry sat down, the rest of the showroom returned to its uneasy quiet. The day's events would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed them. The tables had turned, and in that single moment, the real truth had emerged. True worth is not determined by money or status, but by the integrity and respect one commands. And for Henry Carter, that truth had finally been recognized. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. The realization was hitting hard for everyone present, especially for Margaret, who had not only misjudged Henry, but had also humiliated herself in front of an entire room of wealthy patrons and employees. David stood firm, his gaze unwavering. The sharpness in his voice was chilling, yet it was tinged with a layer of regret, as though he never wanted to have to do this. But it was necessary. For too long, people like Henry had been overlooked, dismissed, and disrespected, simply because of their background, because of the color of their skin, because they weren't wealthy enough to fit the mold of the people in this showroom. Margaret's face flushed with embarrassment, her pride crumbling with each passing second. She had assumed Henry was just another nameless, faceless person who didn't belong in the upper echelons of society, a place where people like her felt entitled to make the rules. Her gaze flickered to the floor as she struggled to maintain her composure. David's words cut through the air, his voice now the undeniable force of truth. This is the man who gave me the foundation to get where I am today. This is the man who showed me that money doesn't define your worth. Your integrity does. You had no right to treat him that way. Henry stood quietly beside his son, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed forward. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet resolve. Henry had worked hard his entire life, through long hours, through hardships, through the cruel and unjust systems that had tried to keep him down. He had earned his place in the world not by the wealth he had, but by the principles he lived by. Margaret opened her mouth, trying to form an apology, but the words wouldn't come. It was clear she didn't know how to save herself, now that the truth had come crashing down around her. The reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave, and she could no longer hide behind her entitled arrogance. David wasn't finished. You look at my father, and you think you know who he is, just like everyone else who's ever judged him. But the truth is, you don't. You don't know what it took for him to get here. You don't know the sacrifices he made so that I could have a chance at a life like this. So, don't stand there and pretend you didn't make a huge mistake. Margaret took a shaky step back, glancing around at the other patrons, who had watched the confrontation unfold in stunned silence. Their eyes weren't filled with pity or shame for her. They were filled with a growing respect for Henry. For the first time, it wasn't the flashy cars or the expensive suits that held people's attention. It was the quiet dignity of a man who had been underestimated, who had been reduced to nothing more than an invisible figure to some, and yet had shown them the true meaning of worth. David turned toward the staff, his voice now cold and commanding. As of today, Margaret's services are no longer required here. His eyes locked onto Margaret's, and there was no room for argument in his gaze. You're fired. The words echoed through the room, and it felt like the ground had shifted beneath Margaret. She didn't know what to say or do, her face pale and her body frozen in disbelief. Her entire world, built on the belief that she was superior, was crumbling in front of her eyes, and it was no one's fault but her own. The room remained silent for a moment, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence it had been before. It was the silence of a lesson learned, of a moment where the truth had finally been heard. David stepped forward, standing beside his father. The respect in his eyes was palpable. You think money can make someone powerful, but it's not the wealth that makes you who you are. It's the choices you make, the way you treat others, and the integrity you carry with you. Margaret, still reeling, couldn't find the words to respond. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had lost everything in an instant, and there was nothing she could do to undo the damage she had caused. David turned to Henry, a soft smile breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "I'll make sure the rest of the world sees you the way I do." Henry finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You've already done more than enough, David." David nodded. They turned to leave the showroom, the staff quietly stepping aside to let them pass. The patrons, who had once eyed Henry with suspicion, now watched him with newfound respect. The man who had been invisible just moments ago now had the full attention of the room. As they walked out of the showroom, the sound of footsteps behind them followed them out into the streets. It was the sound of change, of truth being heard. And for Henry Carter, it was a step toward finally being seen. David's voice was cold, and the room went deathly silent as his words hit the air. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer authority in his words and the weight of the moment were enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Margaret, who had been riding high on her privilege, now stood vulnerable, her back against the wall with nowhere to go. "You're firing me?" Her voice cracked, her pride shattered. She had built her career on her ability to control, to belittle others, to exercise power over people she saw as beneath her. But now, her empire of cruelty was crumbling. There was no escape from this humiliation. David didn't flinch. He merely stared at her, his gaze piercing. "Number, I'm doing something worse." He let the words hang in the air. "I'm making sure you'll never have power over another person again." The room held its breath as Margaret's face drained of color. The arrogance that had defined her presence, that had once made her feel untouchable, was gone. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly over people, especially those she deemed lesser, had been taken from her, not by the force of a court or the power of money, but by a single decision, made by a man who knew better than to fall into the trap of superiority. A man who had learned the value of humanity, of treating others with respect, regardless of their background. David stepped forward, opening a folder. It was a simple document, but to Margaret, it felt like a death sentence. "This is a public record of your termination, not just from this company, but from every affiliated entity. I'm ensuring that you can never work in a position of power again." Margaret's eyes darted from David to Henry, then back to David. She had no words left. She had no defense. She had lived her life believing that wealth and power would shield her from consequences, but now, here she was, facing the undeniable reality that she was just another person, nothing special, nothing above anyone else. In a way, it was worse than being fired. This was public execution of her reputation, her career, and her dignity. Henry stood back, watching the scene unfold. He was no stranger to injustice, but seeing his son wielding his power so gracefully was something entirely new. David had the power to destroy Margaret's life, to reduce her to the same level of suffering she had inflicted on countless people. But he didn't. Instead, David showed her the truth of her actions, the consequences of her behavior, in a way that only someone with a sense of real power could. Henry's voice was calm when he spoke, though the emotions ran deep. "David, this wasn't necessary," he said softly. "You've done more than enough." But he wasn't entirely sure if he was speaking to Margaret or to David himself as a father who was proud of how his son had handled the situation with such poise. David, without looking at his father, nodded slightly. It was necessary. Sometimes people don't understand the weight of their actions until it's too late. Sometimes they need to see what happens when they cross a line. He turned back to Margaret. "But don't worry. I'm sure you'll find something else to do. Maybe in a different world, where you can keep treating people like dirt. But not here. Not anymore." The room was still, the tension hanging thick in the air. The whispers had quieted down. No one had expected this. No one had expected the young billionaire, so accustomed to the luxury of his life, to be so ruthless in his response to injustice. He wasn't like Margaret, who used her power to keep others down. David used his power to level the playing field. Margaret's knees finally buckled, and she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. She tried to steady herself, but she couldn't. She was defeated, not by David, but by the truth that no amount of money or privilege could protect her from the consequences of her actions. The truth that respect wasn't something to be bought. It had to be earned. David nodded to the staff who had watched this unfold, signaling them to clear the room. "Take care of everything," he said, his tone dismissive but controlled. "Let's get back to business." With one final look at Margaret, he turned to leave, his father walking beside him. As they left the showroom, Henry turned to his son, a hint of a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "I'm proud of you, David. You did what had to be done." David looked ahead, his face calm. "It wasn't about what had to be done, Dad. It was about what was right." And with that, the door closed behind them, leaving Margaret to face the fallout of her own choices. Margaret left the showroom escorted by the same security guards who'd been called to remove Henry earlier. She left with her head down, her eyes filled with humiliation and disbelief. The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted drastically. The staff, once silent witnesses to her behavior, now stood in awe, realizing that the power in the room wasn't determined by money or status. It was about integrity, justice, and standing up for what was right. As Margaret's car pulled away, David and Henry walked toward the Rolls-Royce, their strides purposeful. Henry had kept his composure throughout the ordeal, but now, as the moment began to settle, he couldn't help but express his pride. "You didn't have to do that, David," he said softly, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. David smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "Yes, I did." The words were simple, but they carried weight. David understood that there are moments when you must stand firm, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the people around you may not understand. In that instant, he realized that success wasn't about the wealth he had inherited. It was about the values he had been taught and the way he chose to apply them. Henry chuckled as he looked at the Rolls-Royce parked in front of them. "If I'm driving this, you're paying for my gas." David laughed for the first time that day, the tension of the confrontation lifting. "Anything you want, Dad. Anything." His voice was light, but the sincerity in it was clear. They had just witnessed a moment that would forever alter their understanding of power, privilege, and respect. David had not only stood up to injustice, but had also made sure the lesson wasn't lost on anyone. It was clear to the staff, the customers, and anyone who had witnessed the scene that money didn't define a person's worth. Respect did. And respect was something you earned, not something you could buy or force on others. As they got into the car, Henry glanced at David, his expression proud but thoughtful. "You know, David, sometimes I wonder how the world would be if more people cared about the kind of power you just showed. The kind that doesn't need to be flaunted or used to crush others. The kind that actually uplifts people." David nodded, his hand on the steering wheel as he turned the engine on. "I think I've learned that from you, Dad. You always taught me that the way we treat others is what truly matters. I just had to put it into practice." As the car pulled out of the showroom parking lot, the soft hum of the engine blended with the city sounds outside, but inside there was a quiet sense of victory. Not a victory in the traditional sense, but in a deeper, more meaningful way. In that moment, both father and son understood that while justice may never be completely fair or easy to achieve, the actions of one person, one decision, could change everything. The world outside the luxury showroom might have returned to its normal pace, but the lessons learned that day would stay with them forever. For the first time in years, the showroom wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It had become a symbol of what true power and respect looked like. And as for Henry and David, they knew that no matter what the world threw their way, they could face it together, stronger, wiser, and with a new understanding of what it meant to truly lead. "Anything you want, Dad. Anything." David's words echoed in the car, and Henry smiled. Respect, unlike money, was something truly earned, and that was worth more than any Rolls-Royce or mansion. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below.